Elon Musk says he's determined to drive through Donald Trump's policies, despite facing what he says is almost total opposition in Washington. The two men have given their first joint interview to Fox News, much of it focusing on cutting government spending, with Elon Musk claiming that his Department of Government Efficiency would save the US from bankruptcy. He vowed to take on anyone in the Washington establishment who stands in his way.
You know, I think the way to think of me is like I'm a technologist, and I try to make technologies that improve the world and make life better.
Your shirt.
Yeah, and that's why I like my T-shirt says tech support, because I'm here to provide the president with technology support. And now that may seem like, well, is that a silly thing? But actually, it's a very important thing, because the president will make these executive orders, which are very sensible and good for the country, but then they don't get implemented. You know, so. If you take, for example, all the funding for the migrant hotels, the president issued an executive order. Hey, we need to stop taking taxpayer money and paying for luxury hotels for illegal immigrants, which makes no sense. Like, so obviously, people do not want their tax dollars going to fund high-end hotels for illegals, and yet they were still doing that even as late as last week.
Elon Musk. Well, for more on all this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Laskiewicz. Let's start with what is happening in Ukraine. What do you think those talks in Kyiv between the U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg and Ukrainian officials might cover?
They're going to be exactly as Kellogg stated. He is there to listen and is there to note down Kiev's points, which are known in any case. However, the trip is simply to make a formal point that Washington is listening to Kiev. Kiev's are quite simple. They want a guarantee of security, which has to be given by the US, because that's the only power that can really stop Russia. And secondly, they also want to make sure that they are at the talks. And thirdly, they do not want to cede a single square inch of land. And that is going to be what Kellogg's going to listen to. As far as we can tell, he's not going to make any answer to these points. He's simply going to take them back to Trump. But, as I've stated, they're known to him anyway.
One imagines that President Zelensky might ask Mr. Kellogg about his boss's comments last night that Kyiv is to blame for the full-scale invasion waged by Russia 3 years ago and still today.
Yes, the problem with Donald Trump is that he tends to speak actually in an improvised manner, impromptu, and therefore his comments are quite easily going to go wrong. It is quite clear that Ukraine did not start the war. Russia invaded. What I think he meant was that prior to the war, there was a possibility of negotiating with Russia. And indeed, President Zelensky had been elected on the basis that the then separatist movement, which was making, so to speak, some nuisance of itself in various ways, could be dealt with. In the event he didn't, and the Russian invasion came, I think that's what's on his mind. But to state that Ukraine started the war is, of course, wrong.
Well, I mean, just watching that interview or statement from him, I mean, his words were pretty harsh, weren't they? I mean, it was very striking hearing Ukraine's once biggest ally saying something you might expect to hear from Moscow in terms of Mr. Trump appearing to tweak reality by blaming Ukraine for starting and continuing this war.
Well, the answer here is, of course, that we mustn't fall into the trap of being on one side or another blindly. And whilst Donald Trump's comment about starting the war is false, the rest of it is in fact correct. President Zelensky did have the opportunity of negotiating for 3 whole years. He didn't do anything. If you remember, that sometimes he wanted President Putin to be had as a war criminal, which was totally unrealistic. And therefore, Donald Trump is somewhat annoyed at finding that when he makes an attempt to do a peace, President Zelensky suddenly feels that it's wrong. So again, not everything that Donald Trump says is wrong. It's very important to realize that. Moreover, it is true that some of his comments may be somewhat harsh, as you say, but the others were not. And here comes a further point. We have that, unfortunately, President Zelensky has chosen to be somewhat irate with Donald Trump's comment. And the result of that was, of course, Donald Trump fired back, calling President Zelensky a dictator. And although Zelensky is not a dictator, it's true he hasn't been elected. But the problem is there's now threatening a breakdown of relations with Ukraine, which is very bad news for Ukraine. And really, President Zelensky has got to watch out when he deals with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump does speak in an impromptu manner with very emotional points, and riling him is not a good idea.
Well, I mean, it does suggest, certainly to Europeans, that Mr. Trump is adopting the Russian narrative and essentially repeating what Mr. Putin has been saying. Nevertheless, most analysts seem to think that Mr. Trump might have misspoken when he talked about Ukraine starting the war. But going beyond that, in terms of settling that war, is it true to say that Ukraine could have agreed a deal? I mean, you mentioned that partly, but just sort of expand on it, to settle this with Russia by ceding some territory sooner, bearing in mind that that's what's likely to happen anyway now.
Yes, this is the key problem. Ukraine has said it simply wants the 2014 boundaries, period, and has made an attempt to negotiate. One of the problems we have here is calling everything which does not fit into this narrative on the Ukrainian side President Putin, or support for President Putin. There have been now 6,000 years of history, and territorial changes have occurred constantly, including, for example, Poland, which has scarcely had the same boundaries for 100 years at a time. It therefore follows there's nothing new about territorial changes. The question is how they are set about, whether it could have been done and guaranteed Ukrainian independence and NATO and EU membership and so on. And therefore, no serious attempt was made by President Zelensky to come to a peace treaty before. And as you now say, he's now faced back by the prospect of having to cede some territory, because that's what President Trump is implying. And therefore, he could have done this before. And therefore, from that point of view, President Trump is correct. One of the points here is that President Zelensky simply wants to finish the war on his terms, period. But unfortunately, to do that requires the help of other nations, such as America, who no longer see that this is in itself a desirable goal, but without necessarily this implying that it simply surrendered to President Putin, although it would be a victory of sorts for him, of course.
Is it realistic, Dr. Laskiewicz, to think that Ukraine can continue fighting Russia if the US pulls its support? I mean, the Americans are saying you've got to settle. I mean, they do have to settle, don't they? Or does it depend on Europe's position and how it'll respond to what is happening?
To be quite honest, without American equipment and aid, it would be very, very hard for Ukraine to carry on. Europe has neither the money, nor has it got the equipment of that quality, nor has it got the willpower, because Europe is split. On the whole, please note, it's supporting Ukraine, but only, if you like, in a half-hearted manner. You've only got to listen to the Germans over the periods of the last 3 years to realize that they were unenthusiastic about continuing this war. And therefore, he will be in a very difficult position to carry on. However, he does have one exit point. If he were to sell his raw materials, as Donald Trump wants, he would probably still acquire American aid, but it wouldn't be aid now. It would be supplies, military supplies paid for by Ukraine.
Right. Just to be clear, because, I mean, at this stage, as we mentioned, it's not clear whether Europe will step in or give in to Mr. Trump. But as we wait to see what happens with that, because we've actually heard some European leaders saying they're prepared to step into, or at least attempt to step into the breach, your assessment is that Europe does not actually have the capacity to help Ukraine to continue the fight against Russia in the absence of the US.
Quite right. Put it very bluntly, without America, it's not possible really to carry on properly. And in fact, President Zelensky himself has recognized this because he calls for the US to be the guarantor of the peace. He's quite realizes that. But Europe, when it makes statements, the problem is not only doesn't have the clout, but politicians are always firing off statements. The question is, can they and will they actually do this? And there's no indication Europe can step in any shape or form to replace the Americans.
Well, let's move away from Ukraine into sort of internal affairs in the United States. I mean, I noticed that your designation is now international affairs analyst, so we can sort of, you have a broad church of potential areas that you can assess. So let's look at Musk and Trump. I mean, what did you make of that interview given jointly by Donald Trump and Elon Musk? In it, Mr. Musk claimed that his Department of Government Efficiency would save the US from bankruptcy.
Well, allowing for some hyperbole, which you just mentioned, the fact is they've said nothing more but reiterate what Donald Trump said at the start, which is namely he's determined to cut costs. There is nothing new about a businessman suggesting this. Yakoka suggested he could save 5 to 10% of government spending 50 years ago. And the point here is that USA, as it stands, has an enormous government deficit. If it does not cut costs, it will be unable to carry on and was threatened with a shutdown as recently as January that last month. And therefore, some sort of cost cutting has to come, but nobody wants their job cut, which is why there's a great deal of protest about what Elon Musk is doing. The essential problem that Elon Musk isn't what is cost cutting, is the fact that he's, so to speak, sort of outside the system, and people feel threatened by this, as they call him, unelected billionaire, taking the US government to task, and also wants access to all sorts of secret and confidential information, which worries people because he's not really a clear person politically as the normal ones would be. In his defense, it has to be said that the ability to cut costs when you're not a politician may well be easier on the basis that precisely brings a fresh look to all this. But in a sense, all he's really said in that interview is that Donald Trump and he are going to cut costs, come what may, and certainly they will try to do so.
Well, I mean, he mentioned a number of other things that's got the hackles of the Washington establishment up. I mean, I wonder what they might have said in that interview that indicated to you about the future steps of the Trump administration, because, as I mentioned, they had some pretty strong words for the Washington establishment.
Yes, Trump is not a member of the establishment, doesn't like it, doesn't like these mainstream media, is not linked to them, doesn't care what they think. And if he could, he would close down a great many things that the American government is doing. He believes it's wrong to do so. Please note, as I repeat, one very important point, there's nothing that Donald Trump is saying which nobody else has said ever. On the contrary, Ronald Reagan pointed out he would love to close down the whole of the American government on the basis that people could get along much better without it. So what he's intending to do is precisely what many Republicans have always wanted to do, is cut what they see as bloated government spending on programs which are, shall we say, not to their taste, being liberal or simply spending to help people which they don't like, and that therefore they are going to go and try and push this agenda through, and the result will presumably that government costs will fall, but with a great deal of pain.
And in terms of the chemistry between the two men, and amid all the rumors of a competitive feud between them, I mean, did you get the sense that Elon Musk seemed conscious of the fact that these things do matter to Donald Trump, and that Mr. Trump wouldn't want him hogging the spotlight? Because, I mean, in the course of that joint interview, Mr. Musk kept pivoting back to President Trump?
The point here is to remember that many people are looking for a breakdown in this relationship and trying to find signs of this because they really don't want Elon Musk to continue cutting costs. But as far as looking from the outside dispassionately, there is no sign of this relationship breaking down. There's every sign that Elon Musk is doing precisely what President Trump asked for, and that therefore Elon Musk will continue and looking for some sort of cracks in the relationship as a fruitless exercise. Rather, it's going to be what Congress and the legal system does to halt Musk. That's going to be the key break, and not in fact that Donald Trump in some way is going to halt Elon Musk or throw him out of a job or clip his wings.
Dr. Laskiewicz, I want to thank you exceedingly. Well, how really nice to chat with you and to get the benefit of your analysis. He is, of course, an international affairs analyst, and he was talking to me on the line from London, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz.